Welcome to the Catacomic Machine podcast. My name is Matt, and in this episode, you'll hear a conversation Preston Price and I had with Andrea White from Union, as well as Catherine Keller and Clayton Crockett, both of whom y'all should be pretty familiar with by now. We've had them both on the show a couple times now, and Clayton was on, or maybe a couple months ago, to talk about his recent book on Derrida, and Catherine has a new book out as well, called Political Theology of the Earth. The topic of political theology is actually the starting point for this conversation, and it's also the topic for Drew University's upcoming interdisciplinary colloquium. I love that word, colloquium. And that's going to be the end of this month, so March 29th through 31st. It's a Friday, Saturday, Sunday kind of thing. The theme for that is Political Theology at the Edge, Collectivities of Crisis and Possibility. Our guests for this episode are pretty much the planning committee for that event. There may be others I don't know about, but in any case, check out the show notes where you'll find a link to the event with more information, including how to register. It's really affordable. I think it's $20 or $30 if I'm remembering right. And if you're going to be in the New Jersey and New York area, you should definitely sign up and go. I'll be there hanging out on that Saturday, so stop by and say hi. I want to also mention that this will likely be my last episode, at least for a while. I've started school full-time, and that's on top of a 9-to-5 thing I've got going on. I have a wife and a 2-year-old who need attention as well, so yeah, I'm going to take a step back from some things right now, and we'll see if I'll be back. I'm not sure. If I can risk speaking for them, I think it's fair to say that Joseph, Preston, and I, we regret not being able to produce content more regularly. We're just all really busy, and honestly, my life's a hot mess right now, and like I mentioned, I just need to focus on a couple other things. I guess the last thing I want to say is I'm deeply grateful to Joseph for inviting me to be a part of this project, to Preston for being a wonderful friend and conversation partner, to every guest who felt it was worth their time speaking with me, and to anyone who took the time to listen. It's appreciated. I've loved being a part of this, and it's been a great experience. So thank you.
I'm Andrea White. I'm Associate Professor of Theology and Culture here at Union Theological Seminary, and I work in constructive theology, womanist theology, which attends to race and gender issues in African American women's religious experience, and also philosophy of religion.
Nice.
Yeah.
So, Catherine, you want to go?
Hi, I'm Catherine Keller, and I've been teaching constructive theology at Drew's Theological School for over 3 decades. In another moment, it'll be over 4 decades. And I am very involved in this conversation right now around political theology, and have written a book on it, and learn very much from the other communicators today on this panel. So I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Clayton.
Yes, hi, I'm a professor of religious studies at the University of Central Arkansas. I've been here about 15 years, and I focus on sort of continental philosophy of religion and radical theology, and I've become more and more interested in these issues of ecology and the earth, and some also with Catherine and back and forth and learning from her. So yeah,
Awesome.
thanks.
Yeah, for sure. So before we get into like some more of the theoretical or heady questions in political theology, Matt and I thought it'd be great just if Catherine, if you want to talk about the conference that's coming up at Drew to kind of set this in context about why this is on your mind. I mean, besides the larger issues of political theology, ecology, and the earth and stuff, but what's going on with this conference that you're having at Drew that you have every year, and the theme that you're putting on this year? You want to talk about that?
Yes, and it's true, Preston. We have a conference most every year, at least since the beginning of the millennium, and books have been flowing out of it. It's the Transdisciplinary Theological Colloquium at Drew. But this year, the topic is political theology at the edge. As opposed to, having already gone over it, there's still some sense of edginess, but yeah, not yet the great tumble. Being on the verge, perhaps, of something fresh, something new, not just necessarily of catastrophe. And actually, Andrea White and Clayton Crockett are the team that have been envisioning this thing, and we've been planning it together. So it is happening at the end of March, and the formal conference is really the Saturday and Sunday, the 30th and 31st, but we're beginning on the 29th with an afternoon of panels of PhD students from our school and several others presenting on political theology. And then we have a book panel that evening, just after dinner. Clayton's book, the new one on political theology, Derrida, my book, Political Theology of the Earth, and a couple of others, including Tracy West's new book on Africana spirituality. But I should say something about who we're having as the presenters, because their papers will be delivered in advance. Well, Andrea White is one of them. William Connolly, the political philosopher, perhaps the leading political philosopher in the United States, is coming and has been to a TTC before. Michael Northcott, who wrote Political Theology of Climate Change, is coming over from Scotland, or is that Heidelberg? He's been circling. He'll be over. J. Cameron Carter, who needs very little introduction and will charge us with extraordinary insights, is coming. Gilles Onijar, the author of Blood from Colombia, is coming. Let's see, Mehmet Karabala, Noel Vahanian, Balbinder Bogals. We're having some truly comparativist perspectives. A Sikh scholar, Muslim scholar working on political theology, biblical scholar, Paulinist Larry Wellborn, who's involved in political theology, or what I call political theology, and my colleague Elias Ortega Aponte, and of course Kelly Brown Douglas, author of Standing Your Ground from Union, will be joining us. So those are the presenters. That's 11 presenters, but the papers will be distributed in advance, so they won't be each delivering long lectures. There'll be lots of time for conversation. We have a nice set of respondents who will help make that happen.
I'm really excited by all the names you just mentioned. But I'm sort of curious, like beyond the sort of details of the conference, which are exciting, like what was it about this topic of political theology? What about this conversation is important for you guys? Like, why did you decide to do the colloquium this year on this topic at this moment?
Well, I mean, the discourse, the discussion, the conversation of political theology has been going on for a while in various forms. But I think that it's really the sort of ecological and climate perspective of this, and that's Catherine's new book, recent book, The Political Theology of the Earth, that really, kind of gives us that edge that we're trying to get at. So we're trying to deepen this whole discussion of political theology in ecological ways without also sacrificing all of these other critical conversations, including gender, race, thinking about contemporary capitalism and neoliberalism, but also these multiple cross-cultural traditions and conversations that we need to have. And so we're trying to open this up. We're trying to, I think, broaden the very concept and conversation around political theology, and include voices that aren't always a part of this, this topic when we think about it or when we read books about it.
Yeah, well said. And let me just add the obvious that we share a sense of emergency right now, and so the choice of this conference topic is in part very much about our concern about climate change, though most of the papers won't address it directly. I think it's part of the framing, but it's also a response to the more vulgar and particular emergency of the current trumping of U.S. democracy that will then also just speed up the trumping of the earth. It wasn't relying on this president to get going, but which is being accelerated just at the moment when we had to accelerate in the exact opposite direction. So we're very tuned to the sense of catastrophe politically, in terms of democracy, in terms of race, in terms of sexuality and gender, as well as climate, that 2016, I think, has made very vivid, and seemed like this is a conversation, this political theology conversation, with a certain formality and richness already established to it. I think that even gave us a bit of a feeling of some questions already in place, and some wide conversations extending well beyond religious studies or theology or Christianity, that could help really jumpstart this struggle for a new perspective, a new public right now.
I might add to that and add to the comments that both Catherine and Clayton made about the opening up of the conversation and the way in which we understand political theology to be quite expansive and, in fact, distinctive from the Carl Schmittian trajectory of the conversation, so that we're really challenging. I mean, if you just glancing at the lineup of speakers, that in itself is a challenge to the canonical trajectory of political theology coming out of Schmitt. And the expansiveness of the conversation is also touching on what in many ways has been on the ground always already in liberationist strands of thought. And so when we put Anna Jar and Kelly Brown Douglas and myself in conversation, we're doing a part of the themes that come up will be a genealogical tracing of the way, for example, race and religion are co-constitutive, and how they function together and inform each other in violent ways and harmful ways. And Kelly Brown Douglas has, of course, a different angle of vision than what Gil's work will offer. But I think there's this thread, perhaps, on the way in which religion and politics work together. And I'm really curious in the last 5+ years about the traction that political theology has gotten. It seems to be a hot topic, and people want to grab onto what political theology is up to. And my guess is that, among other things, when you say political theology, you're saying something about the relevance of theology, that the political edginess of the project of political theology is kind of a reclaiming of theology away from the dead white guys and into the present crises and what's relevant and pertinent and urgent in our absolutely here and now human existence and human experience. I don't know if my colleagues want to add to that a little bit.
Yes. No, thank you. That's beautiful. and exactly, I think we're coming from. I just want to point out that there's a slight irony in terms of the genealogy of political theology, because I think Andrea's right on that the way we're using it now, and the reason we're using even that phrase that does have its reference to the conversation that got channeled by a fascist, Carl Schmitt, who was a genius, so caught some things which we can look at almost in an inverse, opposed to him, and yet in a dark way learning from him. The darkness has illuminating qualities when we turn it around from our perspective. But the irony is more than that, this conversation, which is largely happening on the left, is somehow triggered by that little book that's almost 100 years old of Carl Schmitt's called Political Theology. The irony is that also that phrase came into theology, into systematic, constructive, liberation-oriented theology in Germany already in the late 60s, early 70s with Johann Metz and Jürgen Moltmann and Dorothea Sölle, who liberated it from Schmitt and denazified the term very systematically. And we're working with it because it seemed, I think, to give some capacity for an honesty for them. They couldn't just call themselves at that point liberation theologians because they were located, in Euro white middle-class academic cultural scenes. And so they didn't feel like they could just call themselves liberation theologians. And I always felt that about myself too. So political theology was handy and also seemed already to promise a certain kind of width, but it didn't take off at all. And even though, other people picked up on it, my professor had picked up on it, my advisor, John Cobb, he wrote Process Theology as Political Theology that came out in like 75. By the time I got to Claremont to study with him, there was no mention of political theology going on. There was, more of the attempts than I was helping to lead them, a dialogue with feminist theory, feminist theology, then of process theology, and then of the liberation movements of Latin America and Black liberation in the U.S. So I just want to say, I think what happened is that in the context of the 70s, 80s, 90s, political theology seemed too generic. It seemed too actually broad and white, even white male, Eurocentric. And there was much more this intensity around our particular movements, which I'm not ever now dismissing as identity politics, not just always the hard edge. But these were extremely particularist movements and finding voice. For me, everything had to be translated through gender, even though I could see huge ranges of connections. But then so feminist theology, not political theology, would be the way I would have wanted my theology to be political. I'm talking about the 70s and 80s for me. And I think that was something like the mood. Something very different is going on when folk like us are claiming the nomenclature now in this millennium in a new way, and welcoming the perhaps the not necessarily the umbrella capacity of it, but I want to say in league with a womanist legacy that's indispensable. It's an intersectional perspective that is at least potentially fortified by this conversation.
You mentioned irony at the beginning of that, and that made me think of something Schmitt kind of famously writes, that, today everything is theology except whatever the theologians are talking about. You take that statement and put it alongside one of his other sort of well-known propositions that, all modern conceptions of the state are secularized theological concepts. And when you do that, I think it's not too far of a stretch to think of Schmitt as a theologian, because he is somebody who's thinking about ultimacy, but in a way that's obviously problematic. And so, I don't know, I think of him sort of as like a Eusebius sort of character, doing almost an imperial theology. And so I think that's ironic because, he presents himself in this very sort of secularist way, but Yeah, anyway, like the engagement around Schmidt, I think, at least with like us here, is not just to simply say no to Schmidt. I think you hinted at that, but to sort of kind of transvalue everything that he's doing. I know Preston he wanted to ask a question about sovereignty, and we'll get to that, I'm sure. But I have this question too about the friend-enemy distinction that he makes and sort of the consequences of that for our moment, especially on the left, where the temptation for a politics of resentment and antagonism is ever present. So how can we think that otherwise and maybe cultivate something more vibrant, more beautiful, more productive, etc.? Yeah.
The point is here very important that you're pointing at. There's something very ambiguous about the friend-enemy distinction. Schmidt's assertion, show me who your enemies are, and I'll show you who your friends are. Or show me who your enemies are, and I'll show you who you are. And your friends, of course, are those who will be like you, but you will be defined by that enmity. And he really understood that fundamental antagonism to be the basis of politics, and that made him, at least for quite a while, join with the Nazi project, in which having the internal enemy of the Jews was especially powerful for galvanizing unity throughout the nation. But I'm very tempted just to bat away that definition of the political or of solidarity, and want to say it's about a common struggle for a more common good, not about common enmity. And yet, I'm right now kind of casting Schmidt as my enemy, hoping, for some solidarity when I'm with my students. I mean, I'm so aware of the quick signals about racism or about some kind of toxic masculinity, about the proto-fascism, about Trump, these references that are naming enemies and that quickly consolidate a unity. That's a dynamic that's at play. I mean, I grew up with it in my family, which was a very conflicted family, but when we could name someone as common enemy, we could really be together. So it's a powerful dynamic. I think what's important, though, is that when we are reflecting theoretically on the importance of our discourse about friends and enemy, and when we're thinking from that theory to a practice, we might always want to make sure we decenter the friend-enemy distinction, not think that it's unimportant or that we can transcend it. The commandment to love the enemy, I take rather seriously, is not a denial that we have enemies. No, we're likely to make more enemies just by preaching the radical love doctrine. They might even crucify us. So it's not about naivete as to enmity or a hope that we'll all be friends. I don't think it's that. It's recognizing the force of enmity, but it's deconstructing the dependence on the enemy to define who we are. We can define ourselves, and here is where Chantal Mouffe and William Connolly are very helpful. We can define ourselves in terms not of antagonism, the sheer opposition, but of agonism, a lovely word meaning struggling, and hinting that there's some agony in the struggle. And I tried to theologize it by taking the notion of respectful agonism from William Connolly and even calling it an amorous agonism. There's a positive embrace of difficult difference, which is, I think, what love is. A positive embrace of difference, an affirmative, mindful embrace of that difference that we can politicize, and only therefore, I think, even get along with each other and our different priorities enough to create a really broad political coalition. rather than making those with a slightly different priority, the enemy, which often happens in academic scenes. So yeah, an intersectionalism as positively inviting, as stimulating a kind of political eros that has also a deep theological tremble to it. That's what I'm hoping for with it.
I want to hear from Clayton, but I want to jump in here because Catherine just spoke to precisely what I was thinking in response to your question, which is this impulse to understand difference as a problem to be overcome. That we often think of difference in antagonistic terms that then creates difference in terms of hierarchies and social structures that turn violent. And so difference is identified as the root of the problem in this neoliberalist agenda that we are all the same under the skin, and why can't we just get along and sing Kumbaya? And I would contend that if we reconfigure our understanding of difference, and I love your language, Catherine, of embrace of difficult difference, and the evoking of the erotic and the relational with difference, so that we don't come up against this binary friend enemy, and then we've suddenly created these artificial boxes that we put people in order to relate with one another. So the political and ethical implications of our struggle with difference is just ubiquitous and pervades our thinking. And I think we've got difference wrong when we think of it as a problem to be overcome.
Amen.
Yeah, I agree with what both of you just said. And I think that that's so important and so extraordinary.
There's not enough antagonism between us.
Sorry.
Sorry, Clayton, proceed.
But
Too
it's
much of a love fest.
I mean, I want to use some Derridian terms just because I'm steeped in that language. So Catherine already said that the opposition between friend and enemy deconstructs, like it can't be held on to, even though there's a certain strategic and even relational relative use of that and positioning of that. But I think it's important to argue and to note and to see that there is no absolute enemy. Because if there's the absolute enemy, then the friend is only defined by opposition to that, or what's not that, negatively. And then there aren't really true friends, because they're only determined in relation to the absolutization of the enemy. Mm-hmm. You see that? So this kind of struggle, the agonisms and the political embrace of difficult differences, which are erotic and relational, as Andrea and Catherine just said and affirmed, right, means that it's a different terrain. It's a different ground from the Schmittian one, and it's not just being politicized because it's always already political. You're always already in a political context, and we're recognizing with the term, the inextricability of religion and politics, what we call religion, what we call politics, because I don't think that either has an essence that's separate from the other, that could be separate or completely contained from the other. Yeah. And for me, what I've been trying to do, or what I've been doing, is reading sort of the later Derrida as almost undertaking a running engagement with and against Carl Schmitt. Like he talks about him in The Politics of Friendship explicitly. Mm-hmm. But I think that a lot of his later work, including in Philosophy in a Time of Terror and in Rogues, is kind of about what I call a political theology without sovereignty, even though Derrida doesn't use the term political theology, showing how sovereignty deconstructs, and that this gives us a whole different framework, a whole different situation. I mean, we don't need to do this through Derrida or think this through Derrida, because there's so many other ways that we could think about this. But it's recognizing that there's a common struggle, but we're not all the same. And that even putting this in, this is what I think Catherine is trying to do, putting this in the context of an ecology, is not supposed to supersede or overcome, or I could use a loaded word, trump, all of these differences and all of these issues of, again, gender, race, class, all these other dynamics that we still have and that are still with us and that are still operative on every level, that we have to think through and that we have to utilize and we have to struggle with. And again, in the context of climate change, but it doesn't change, even though it changes, it doesn't change or eliminate all these other differences. And I think that's what Catherine's trying to do, and I think that's what Andrea's talking about, and I just want to affirm that.
Yeah, that's a great revalorization or reconception of what the political really is, or what the political can be, opposed to the friend-foe distinction. It's more about a politics of friendship or a politics of love, of transforming and transgressing those the friend-foe distinction towards more of like an embracing of the differences that we all have with each other, like the difficult differences that we have that we just are in terms of our social and local positionalities as human beings. The question I had about sovereignty, I don't know if it's relevant. I mean, you were just talking about a little bit, Clayton, about deconstructing sovereignty. And I was just I guess my question was just, what is the relevance of sovereignty today in terms of, I know Schmidt wants to talk a lot about the sovereign is the one who decides. And I brought that up today because we are facing real catastrophe with ecology, and it's being driven by an economic machine which is destroying us, not just ecologically, but in many other ways. So I was having this conversation with a friend a few weeks back, and he thinks that the sovereign is still necessary, but not as not as like a one decider, but as somebody as the multiple still making decisions about what confronts us and conflicts us, and we need to make a decision to stand against that. So I'm wondering what all y'all's thoughts would be around this idea of not the sovereign as a one decider, but as sovereignty maybe reconceptualized or deconstructed to be able to be used as to make a decision as a collective against those things that threaten us all.
I mean, the question of sovereignty goes back to a claim that Clayton just ended with, and I would want to add to his list also a politics of the agnostic, and so I'm not sure if I can relate this to the question of sovereignty, but I want to make sure we don't end with a warm fuzzy, a wishy-washy warm fuzzy. And sometimes the language of eros and love and relations can be dysfunctional. So the relational isn't in itself sufficient to get at a robust politics that we're seeking. And then the question of sovereignty. Yeah, right. The question of sovereignty raises questions of authority and legitimacy and power and coercion. And I would suggest that what we need to be talking about is what is, just like this point I'm trying to make about the agonistic, what is a productive agony? What is power that's generative? Mm-hmm. What about the powerless? It doesn't make any sense to talk about the ills of power for those who don't have power, who actually need more power. So the question of sovereignty is it's a political and theological question insofar as it gets at the way in which, I mean, of course, I mean, there's so much to say. The way in which our politics and our God talk get conflated, and we put divine sanction on all of the forms of oppression that we so creatively imagine. But I also wonder, how do we talk about power in a way that's also generative and productive? Yeah, I hope that's responsive to your question.
Yeah, definitely a politics of liberation in that sense, or a sovereignty of liberation or something.
Yeah. And I'm going to listen as I'm packing up.
Okay. Thank you for coming on today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Sorry to leave.
Listen,
Okay.
Let me just underscore what Andrea is articulating so powerfully with the alternative kind of power we're looking for. Says, I don't think we can get rid of sovereignty any more than I think we can get rid of the friend-enemy dynamic in politics. But we can decenter it, we can destabilize the way it's been used, and we can look for other primary criteria than sovereignty, but especially when one is working with folk from the two-thirds world, one realizes that for them, sovereignty isn't the problem. Sovereignty is what they want more of for their own communities or their own nations. Their food, even, as a new book coming out by Yael Dennis is going to show, political theology of food. The food sovereignty movement is a two-third worlds movement that is pushing back against the hideous injustice that's being perpetrated by the whole agribusiness global schematism of neoliberal capitalism. So one can't then, from a cushy North American perspective, just poo-poo sovereignty. And there's something that in the United States we did have to contribute, hopefully again sometime, the sovereignty of the people, which inherently deconstructs the classical concept of the sovereign as that exceptional individual. But we shifted the sovereignty of the people into its own tragic exceptionalism, the American exceptionalism with all of its race and Anglo-Saxon exceptionalisms built in, as Kelly Brown Douglas shows. So I think the job is to extricate sovereignty from exceptionalism, but at the same time to relativize it to a deeper and more consistently crucial sense of the political as the struggle beyond critical difference, for a shared good, that struggle together for a greater good. That's on the ground. That's in every little activist group dealing with its own differences or differences to the next group, let alone dealing with differences between parties. So I would just always want to prevent sovereignty from setting itself in the throne of politics, while not for a moment pretending that we can simply disregard the concept. And when Derrida wants to get beyond sovereignty, I think he's deconstructing, not disregarding.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what both Andrew and Catherine have been saying and affirming. And there can't be, or we would not want to affirm any kind of sovereignty of the one decider. And so if there is such a thing, sovereignty exists, it has to be multiple, and it is distributed. And the forces that are, the machines that are working against us are also distributed. And if we could think about money, we could think about capital, we could think about military force, we could think about the police and the policing that is done against us in our name and in some ways diabolically for us. We have to be able to think about sovereign multiplicity in multiple ways. And I think that's absolutely essential. So for me, one of the ways I think about it, and this is just borrowing from sort of systems theory and physics, is to think about more in terms of like what's called a singularity, a kind of a perturbation or maybe a difference that makes a difference, that sort of causes a bifurcation or even a cascade. And so this is a play on words here in English, and I apologize for it, but the difference between reign, R-E-I-G-N, as a kind of imposition of power, top down, and reign, R-A-I-N. And here I'm thinking of Lucretius, the rerum natura, and this whole idea of the swerve that comes in. And that swerve, I think, is a part of how we want to think sovereignty in a positive, generative way if we want to think it, I think. I mean, that's what I would say. And in terms of the left or leftist kind of politics, what we need to avoid is the temptation to think that, well, to put this in theological terms with Heidegger, only a God can save us. That's wrong. That's false, right? A God can't save us, and nobody can save us.
Is that wrong?
Nobody can save us. The idea of a charismatic personal leader, the desire for a leader or a master who would come along in salvific redemptive terms that would lead us to the promised land, that would lead the struggle and the victory over the forces against us, the enemy of capitalism, that's a false hope. That's a fantasy. We have to give that up. We're on our own, but we need to think, and again, these different languages, right? Complex assemblages, rhizomatic networks, multitudes, quantum indeterminacy, ontological materialism, if we want to think in terms of Karen Barad, the eco-social inception of Catherine Keller, the more than human earth-bound, Bruno Latour, and then the cyborgs, or what it means to make kin, and what Donna Haraway calls the Cthulhu scene, right? That there's all these multiple complex ways to think and to theorize what we could call sovereignty, power, but also possibility and potential for doing things differently is what I think I want to be on the side of, whether we call that sovereignty or not, because it's the one that we have to get rid of or eliminate.
You said a bunch of things in there that kind of got my brain going in a bunch of different directions, but like you talked about this desire for a salvific leader.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned we've already been talking about Derrida a little bit, and sort of this theme of hope that I think sort of cuts through a lot of our discussion when we're talking about political theology and politics as such, and all these kinds of things. But in later Derrida, he talks about democracy to come, and there's a lot sort of packed into that little phrase that we probably can't unpack here. But one thing that he perhaps had in mind was just maybe that there's something yet to be cashed out by democracy, by which I don't mean like a form of governance, right? Or a statecraft or whatever, but in more of a Spinozist kind of sense, like democracy as ontological unfolding of being in time and space. And there's a sort of like revolutionary potential to that. I could be thinking about this wrong, but it seems that often when we talk about hope, it takes on this sort of like messianic tonality, right? And that future is always imagined as a sort of inbreaking, a breaking in, rather than a breaking out, like a breakout. Sort of thinking Deleuze there. But I'm sort of curious to get your thoughts on what may be a tension here. Like for me, I have a sort of a commitment. I'll admit I have a commitment to radical eminence. So how can someone like me think about the future? How can I hold on to hope without resorting to like wishful thinking? How can I capture this potential of the messianic within an immanent framework? And like, does that question even matter?
It's an endless question series that you're asking there. I mean, there won't be an answer, which is great. I think it's more about getting into the agonism of the inquiry together. But I would think that Derrida's picking up of the messianic and strongly affirming it as a messianicity over and against messianism, or the hope that finally that Messiah will come or come again and get it right this time. But his strong affirmation of the messianic is in tension with a radical immanence, if that's understood as a scheme in which there's a kind of assemblage of assemblages which constitutes the whole, holds all that is possible within itself. I think here whenever the messianic is signaled, there's a certain kind of transcendence signaled. It can be the transcendence of the supernatural sovereign, who's first of all God the Father, the great Lord himself, then imbuing the imperial Lord beneath him with his power, all mediated through the Lord Christ. So there's that model of transcendence. There's another way of reading transcendence, which is more etymologically correct, a transcending, a going beyond. So a sense that there's something that takes us beyond, that calls us beyond the contained all of where we are, to realizations that couldn't have been predicted. So there's some reflection always with Derrida then on the impossible becoming possible. And that sense of the messianic, I certainly can't help affirming that there's that which is imminent to this moment that is calling us beyond what in this moment we can grasp. So something calling us beyond, does that give hope? Well, I really think it does when these are humble, grounded moments familiar with great grief and disappointment rather than, hungry for pie in the sky kind of moments. But this is why it's then very important, if one is going to work with any God concept, to work with a radically immanent concept of God. That doesn't mean purely immanent. I don't want pure immanence. I want radical immanence. I want immanence that takes us deep down to the radix, the whole rhizomatic root system, but not that thinks that it can close all things within some knowable circumference. But then this is hope against the hope of supernaturalist power drives. I think the most simple and important thing is always to quote Karl Barth. This is the only time I ever quote Karl Barth, but saying that Christians are not pessimistic or optimistic. We're hopeful. I always want to teach people to distinguish between hope and optimism. I love Solnit's notion of hope in the dark.
Yeah, and I guess I'm less attached to the term or the word hope, but I think, hoping against hope or other ways of formulating this. But I like what you said about the transcendence, and maybe not the transcendent as something beyond or outside of the world, but the trans, like just the trans as a kind of movement, a generative movement, and again across.
Expression.
Yes, exactly. And so thinking about this in what we call immanent terms, and immanence is also a complicated term and can be easily be, sort of objectified. But for me, it's not about against the messianic or messianism, but anytime that gets configured or understood as a kind of passivity, right? The passivity that some of those conversations can engender in us or in others is what I find problematic in some of those discussions. And I don't think that exhausts what we call the messianic or a kind of messianicity, but that's what I would note. And then thinking about this whole question of the future, because it's for Derrida, the future, the democracy to come, is the idea that the future is not just the extension and perpetuation of the present, that there could be something absolutely like an event or something new or something completely different could occur, and that opens to that. But that doesn't mean that those things, those possibilities of an event aren't already operative as potentialities and possibilities and relationalities, even in a kind of a cloud, right, of indeterminacy that we're already sort of in the midst of. And so, the term future is complicated here as well. And then I would just, in terms of what Preston said about the kind of, or Matt, I'm sorry, it was Matt, right? Sorry, confusion. With the kind of the Spinoza sort of Marxist democratic notion that it has to be more than human. It can't just be anthropological, anthropocentric in the sort of the the classical ways that, again, even Marx, certainly falls into, because of what we've learned about the more than human, the other than human, even the other than human in us. And so this weird God concept that's still around in our language, which doesn't mean what we normally think it means in terms of theism. And then we also have this other term, which is sort of a quasi-God, but not, which is Gaia, right? So we think about what Isabel Stenger calls the intrusion of Gaia, which is an inbreaking, but it's already inbroken. And so it's not waiting for something to break in because it's already broken. It's already broken in, but we've tried to cover it over for the longest time, and now we can't sort of ignore it anymore. And Gaia is not God, but Gaia becomes this sort of crystallization and concentration of how one of the ways that we're thinking about the planet, the earth, the climate, the people, the ecosystems, in positive and negative terms. And I know this is hopelessly abstract, but I can't help thinking.
We love hopelessly abstract.
Yes, but I'm working on
hopefully abstract.
trying to think about energy, and I think that if there's anything to what we call God or ultimate reality, I want to think about it in terms of energy, but in terms of energy transformation that wouldn't have an opposition between material and physical on the one hand and what we could call spiritual on the other, because it is fully immanent in the positive sense of that. But energy can take us away from some of these contexts, or it can be infused and suffused within them in I think powerful and liberating and revolutionary ways. And that's what I'm sort of hoping for, wanting. But I also recognize the dangers of, all of our terms. No words are sort of neutral or innocent. No words are necessarily bad and irredeemable either, but it's just how we configure them and how we use them. That hopefully makes a difference.
That's great. I want to stay with some of the things that you were saying, and also staying with Derrida for a moment. What I'm thinking here, maybe we'll give Catherine a chance to say something before she has to go in a few minutes. But I'm thinking about the way you bring together, or you sort of draw on Karen Barra's engagement with Derrida that helps us think about indeterminacy as something not over and beyond the determined, but that the determined or the actual, maybe we can say materiality or whatever, is shot through with the darkness of the virtual. So that matter or matter energy, you've already complicated that these things are transferable, that they can be understood not only as productive in unexpected ways, taking on novel form and so on, but within language, the way we talk about ultimacy, the way we do theology is also shot through or shrouded in indeterminacy. Dominic Crossan has this really cool phrase that I like. He talks about an epistemology of darkness, which I think kind of encapsulates that idea. And maybe we can bring that within a materialist framework that helps us think about other things besides narrative, like politics and ecology and so on. And I don't know if this kind of darkening has any sort of positive implications that we can maybe talk about here. But how can something like this, if it does, how can something like this be encouraged or cultivated in sort of practical terms?
Plunge into that dark hole that you're opening up. I wrote a book called Face of the Deep. That's really a long meditation on the indeterminacy and the creativity of darkness, and darkness here really lodged symbolically in the second verse of the Bible, with darkness over the face of the deep. It was a strange 300-page meditation on a single verse. One could read it as, but where that took me is into a kind of diagnosis of a fear of that that darkness and that deep that has structured much of Western civilization, the deep being called the tehom, so the fear can be called the tehomophobia. And what does it mean to lift up an alternative that's just as biblical, that is tehomophilia? I have a young Chinese friend who has really taken and queered tehomophobia and tehomophilia systematically in a new book on queer ancient ways. But that it seems to me there's nothing more important for our capacity, even just to communicate across the difference of our perspectives, which are very close to each other in such amazing ways, and yet the differences are deep. To be able to communicate across these differences, apart from the really painful differences, if we want to communicate across them and not just do enemy, is to tune into that unknowing in ourselves, just quickly, like a breath, to tune in to the indeterminacy of the conversation. And Barad always reminds us that, if we go back to Niels Bohr and the argument with Heisenberg, we can't reduce indeterminacy to uncertainty. And you were very carefully not doing that, Preston, right? The indeterminacy is the richer depth here, that is not just about cognitive uncertainty, but locates that cognitive uncertainty in relation to real indeterminacy as to what is going to occur in our relationship to any other, even an electron, in the next moment. There's a certain margin of unknowability that is the indeterminacy of matter itself. It seems to me strategically a kind of meditative practice of remembering that uncertainty and its ontological indeterminacy. It keeps us a little bit open to finding some new basis for communicating with that which seems really problematically different. Not of joining it, not of agreeing with it, but of opening up some third space. And that third space, as it begins to open, is deep and it's dark. And so it's been important for me to connect politics to the tradition of negative theology and apophatic mysticism. I want to just point out to you a journal called Salvage. You'll see the G in here is the hammer and sickle, but this is edited by China Miéville, who's the great author of fantasy novels, but he's also a Marxist in a very important tradition. But he's got an essay in the recent volume of Salvage on apophatic Marxism, apophatic politics, and he and I have been in wonderful conversation about that zone of darkness for some time, because Marxism that knows it all is horrifically dangerous. That's the certainty and the determinism that results in a Stalin, but a Marxism, a socialism that is open to an indeterminacy that might then be able to take in great forms of pluralism and democratic process. That is perhaps worth working with and hoping with. But just want to say yes, if we can just very knowingly think about the unknowingness that shadows our every proposition. I don't think that weakens us. I think it gives us a form of communicative and resilient strength.
Before you go, I want to ask you, are you an advocate for contemplative practice? Mm-hmm. Is that something that you engage in, or how about you, Clayton?
What do you mean by contemplative practice?
I mean, do you guys meditate? I don't know. I've had sometimes. You try to do sometimes. Okay.
I think it's a very useful technology because so much of our, it doesn't have spiritual as such, but there's so many things that demand and distract our attention, our focus, and it's hard to, we're seeing so much, I'm seeing with my students, so much anxiety, so much depression, so much distraction. And it really is hard to attend to just about anything anymore. And I think meditative practice can be a way to try to, control and to gain some kind of emphasis on how we attend and how we concentrate and how we think and the possibilities for thinking, because this just intense distraction and the profusion and proliferation of images is something that really disorients us in unbelievable ways. And I think this is partly political as well.
I'm thinking of T.S. Eliot, distraction from distraction by distraction. And yeah, that's how we have to be kept by the present economic order. So we can keep getting focused on the new thing to buy, so we don't ask the strong questions and fake news prevails. But I do want to say, I don't have a regular spiritual practice of the most ascetic or clear sort. I love doing yoga as much as I can, and I work on my breath, but I don't always then build in the 5 or 20 or 55 minutes of silence. I think of walking for me as meditation, try to do it a lot. I think of my writing practice as a contemplative practice, and I have to breathe with it and allow periods of quiet within it, where I'm just open and waiting and not getting freaked out because it's not all flowing and coming from me, or because I don't have the right source to tell me how to do it. So I find it something to build into everything. I'm part of a Christian community at Drew. We're a theological school, and we're more than Christian, but there is a Christian community there. I am part of an amazing United Methodist Church up the street here on West End Avenue that has been hanging its rainbow flag for decades, so that's still illegal in our denomination, and that is heavily involved in offering literal sanctuary in relation to immigration and working on race issues. I'm very proud of it. But I say, so I'm happy that I can actually be part of communities where we have some singing and some praying together that feels real. Though sometimes the language is too much, still telling God what God ought to do for us, as opposed to the deeper kind of prayer, which is tuning to possibly divine possibilities that it's up to us to actualize. But yeah, I mean, and this is political. This is William Connolly's. We're over and over coming back, as in his case, a kind of Buddhist-tinged atheist, but one who wants to be in conversation with certain forms of theology, even Christianity, but he's always emphasizing, using Foucault, the personal cultivation, self-cultivation, but emphasizing that activist coalitions are just getting exhausted and falling apart left and right in a way that does often get counteracted. I mean, can be helpfully addressed through forms of spiritual practice, whether they're religious or atheist. That otherwise we just can't develop the sensitivities that would support what he's now calling a multifaceted democracy, pushing towards a truly democratic socialism.
Yeah.
I'm good for another 5 minutes if you want.
Are you? Yeah. Preston, give her a question.
I do, but I don't know. The answers might exceed the 5 minutes that we. Maybe we'll give Catherine. Maybe you should go first then. So a little while back, we were talking about this conception of the human, and I'm wondering if maybe we can problematize what we mean by human, because as Clayton was saying, signifiers don't always signify the same exact. Signified over time. Different epochs have a different translation or interpretation of what we mean by different terms. And so I wonder if maybe we can rethink what we mean by human, especially in concert to this idea of like the messianicity of the possibilities of something emerging out of a community or communities. Like I think Agama talks about the community to come, or something along those lines. Or we can even say the communities. We can pluralize communities to come. in terms of like this idea of the event or events, and how Clayton also talks about this idea of like energy transformation along gradients, that like the complexities and I don't know the physics behind it. I'm not a physics person. I don't know much about that science, but this idea of like how the gradient transformation actually can be productive and generative. When we were talking about generative power earlier. So I'm just kind of connecting these ideas about how we can conceive of humanity, or this. I think you talked about the term, Catherine, in your book, the universe animal. Am I saying that right? This idea of like connecting like the human to to our animal history and present, and like also connecting it into the ecology and Gaia, and having this more robust intra and interpersonal, but extra personal conception of humanity, and how we can reconceive of the human and how that might be profitable or productive for reconceiving or conceiving political theology in light of what the human can become, or what is humanity. And I wonder if maybe you can share some reflections on that, if that makes sense.
Oh, it makes too much sense. It seems like to me it is about keeping the concept of the human in metamorphosis. And that just means to look more honestly at what the human always was and always is. And so I have liked reflecting on humanimality, just how is our humanness already an animality. There's endless theoretical resources for that, and increasingly one can think about how we are like other animals without in any way committing a reductionism and simplifying or minimizing what makes humans different from other animals. And indeed, I have loved reading Power's great novel, The Overstory, which gets you thinking about what we have in common with trees, as does How Forests Think by Cohn. So that there is zoological and botanical community and solidarity available to us if we could wake up to these non-human aspects of ourselves, before we actually destroy the critical mass of these common creatures. The trees are burning and going. The species are being exterminated, and we're setting ourselves up to be human just in relation to machines, it would seem. But short of the cyborgian nightmare, the point is not that we aren't also cyborgs. I'm a little bit with the early Haraway. I'd rather be a cyborg than a goddess, or I'd just as soon be a cyborg as a goddess. I wouldn't mind some of both. I'm into a notion of
I think you're a goddess, Catherine.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Where to put as long as you know where to put the batteries, you're okay.
Yeah, right, exactly. All right, plug that goddess in. But a certain theosis could be tinged female, not just male, in our becoming divine. But that becoming divine, I suspect, means becoming earth, because that's the most godlike being that we have any access to, would be the earth itself. As old Nicholas of Cusa saw it, it's the earth made in the image of God that we can approach. In fact, the whole universe is more like God than anything within it. So I'm hoping that through various approaches to our radically interdependent becomingness as humans, we start bumping consciously into all of the non-human others that make us up, right down to the cellular and indeed the electronic level, and become more enmeshed in these zones of non-humanity that make us up and that we help to make up, and that we might we might share this vastly more than humanness as a mode of solidarity with other humans who are concerned about having a viable future for our species. And that means not just for a few pockets of super rich humans who can, move to Canada or Norway and build Buckminster Fuller balls around them and enslave others outside of them and live a nice cyborgian life. So yeah, there are possibilities for us, and I don't think that they glow and work unless they are possibilities that we are grounding in our non-human solidarities.
That's beautiful. Yes.
Oh, is it a sign that I should go now?
No. You stay as long as you like.
Let me stay and hear one more round, and I'm gonna let me hear whatever your next round is, and then I'll say goodbye.
Do you have a response at all to that question at all, Clayton?
Well, just back to the indeterminacy. I mean, the idea that there's no clean breaks, and I think again, somewhat genealogically, and the work of Bruno Latour and We Have Never Been Modern, as a way to sort of think about how this was artificially set up, where the social contract, the politics occurs only among human beings, right? These are societies, agents, persons, and then nature, the natural world, the non-human, becomes solely an object of study, non-knowledge by the scientists, and how in some ways what we call loosely, broadly postmodernism is about the breakdown of that separation, which was always wrong and always artificial, was never clean, but we're becoming more and more sort of aware of that. And then more recently, the sense of which for a long time are part of the ideology in philosophy, religion, humanities, as a kind of social constructivism of knowledge, which kind of dismissed or ignored a lot of the natural sciences. And even when it drew on them in particular ways. So I think that I teach a course on religion, science, and technology, and so I always start out with Thomas Kuhn's book on the structure of scientific revolutions, because I think that's the most influential, important book about science for non-scientists in the 20th century. But I think that Karen Barad's book, Meeting the Universe Halfway, is the most important book about science for non-scientists in the 21st century. That makes sense? I mean, I'm not saying scientists are reading this and taking it seriously, but non-scientists are having to read this and think about this.
Yeah.
But it represents a kind of a new re-engagement, and part of it's political and part of it's ecological, but a new engagement with science, natural sciences, systems theory, even mathematics, if you think about somebody like Badiou. And then for me, what the most interesting or the most, sort of like exciting is what's sometimes called new materialism, where you kind of cross a lot of times a kind of feminism with science studies. And Catherine mentioned science fiction. Science fiction is such an extraordinary, vital, place. It's not just about, reading fun novels, but it's about, seeing how science in itself is fictional, and that, the fiction isn't just really fiction, but people like Haraway, like Barad, I could think of Catherine Hales, I could think of Catherine Malibu and some other contexts, but the ways in which we're having to re-engage with these scientific conversations and this scientific knowledge about non-human animals, about plants, trees, thinking about the work of Len Margulis on bacteria, symbiosis, symbiogenesis, all these kinds of conversations that were maybe sort of left out or not, at least in the North American English context. We're not really part of the conversation explicitly until this sort of the turn of this century, and then in various ways. And so it's about attending to some of those, trying to be responsive to some of those. And right, it's not about evacuating or eliminating the human, but seeing the human embedded in various contexts and also a result of various transpositions, transformations, but also contributing to other maybe more than human, maybe less than human, maybe non-human transformations and processes. And so, but these all have political context as well. And that's what's sounds weird, sounds sort of not, doesn't make sense, but I think it's absolutely vital and true. And if you look at somebody like Anna Tsing and thinking about the way that this certain mushroom, in the context that it's embedded in all around the world, that we can't tell any kind of story of just human subjects, right? Without other things. We can't also tell stories about trees without their interactions, relationships with other things other than trees, including fungi. And it's all fascinating. It's all rich. It's all interesting. But there's also an urgency to it with the climate change and with the situation of our planet. And what's also called the Anthropocene, but also the Capitalocene, or whatever sort of scene we want to use to invoke our contemporary situation.
And its obscenity.
Yeah, that too.
You mentioned postmodernity, which sort of aligns in many ways with post-secularism, and where this line is sort of blurred between politics and religion, and it's being challenged. But I'm sort of curious about to what extent this return to religion can really affect the transformation in our economics and our politics and stuff that are demanded by the kind of global crises we're beginning to face. Some of the things that we've talked about here already. And I don't know, there was this article like within the last week I saw about advocating for or celebrating the rise of the religious left. And okay, yeah, sure, that might be a good thing. But I'm sort of like cautious about that, and maybe even a little bit skeptical. Because it seems to me that often when I listen to my leftist Christian friends, they seem like cynics. They're sort of just transposing culture wars into a clash of representations. So that like our affects and desires and so on are just they're just kind of representations of a party, a god, etc. So that we can imagine the common good or imagine a future, but that imagination is already sort of delimited by a certain horizon, maybe a capitalist horizon, we could say. And I like the way Antonio Negri puts it. I wrote this down. He writes, he asked the question, is it possible not to confuse religion with liberalism, even while the latter extinguishes itself as the dominant ideology? And I think that's the question I have. I don't know. What are your thoughts about a potential for a revitalized Christian left? Yeah.
I'm still here.
Yay.
The Christian left is still here. Yeah, I think you're right that one can't look for salvation from our present catastrophic trends from any kind of return to religion. I think the point that a lot of us who are involved in political theology and or in the religious left are making is surely not that it's a return to religion that's going to save us or save the planet. Rather, that the honest exposure of the possibilities that have been inherent in religion all along and that have been the source of the social justice movements of the West from the beginning should be exposed. But the point is then that it's not that religion will save us or that it would be sufficient. It's always insufficient. But it might be necessary. It might be a necessary element in the great, chaotic alliance that I think we need to form. If it's true that in some sense it isn't just that, theology is always already political, but that then you have the political theology line that politics is always already theological. I think it's hard not to see the truth in those claims, but then where do we go next? But I would think the point isn't about then where do we place our trust for transformative agency. That's not the kind of God that I'm thinking through anyway. But isn't it a question of unleashing the potencies for transformation, for liberation, wherever they are embedded? And it's just the fact that the major stream of influence towards political, social liberation is coming out of the Exodus traditions. They were mostly suppressed by the Eusebian traditions, turned into their opposite. But to free us from the ongoing effect of that Constantinianism, I think the release over and over and again of the Exodus motifs remains important. Maybe I work with too many African Americans and Latin American folk, but it makes it just too evident that we can't do without those ancient Exodus narratives being somewhere acknowledged and in play. I mean, I think this is why Ernst Bloch wrote this massive 3 volumes on the principle of hope, and from his perspective as an atheist communist who nonetheless saw the origins of the social movements, not just in the ancient Exodus narrative, but then in the way in which it got replayed through the Acts community, the early Christian communities, and then through the radical social movements of Europe, with the Quakers and their indispensable teaming up with Gandhi and inspiring of Gandhi, and the flooding back of that Quaker spirituality into Martin Luther King's movement, etc. So I just think we want to attune ourselves to these potentialities where they might release some ancestral power, and that doesn't mean we should convert to a religion, just not repress it in ourselves, but let it be part of the gradient transformation. I think that's what seems crucial to me. That's why I love conversations with lots of non-religious folk. The nice irreligious Jew I'm married to just came back home into the apartment. Now, hi, Jason.
So sorry, I'm up against time here now, but
yeah.
I guess I really am now too. Okay.
But in terms of the return of religion, which is, it never went away, so it didn't return, but Casanova says it's a kind of a deprivatization, which again, it was never fully privatized, but it's become more apparent. So I think it's both a symptom and a potential liberating possibility. So it's a symptom of the breakdown of modern liberalism, and it's most evident and obvious on the right with these identitarian, these evangelical, these fundamentalist, and even these proto-fascist sort of forms of religiosity. There's also religions and religious sentiments and hopes and possibilities on the left, like the Exodus narratives that Catherine just mentioned. But it's, that we have to be able to cut across, sort of transgress the opposition between secular and religious, for alliances, for solidarities. It's not about, it has to be in a religious guise, but it's not about excluding religion or religions either. It's about configuring things differently. And I do think that my friend, colleague, alter ego in some ways, Jeff Robbins, talks about the kind of sort of with Negri, and even maybe take him a step further, the liberating possibilities of religion for a radical democracy, and that it always has both of these potentials within it, the kind of the shutting things down and appropriating, but also the liberating potentials. And so it's about not being trapped within the opposition either way. The temptation to think that it's one or the other.
That's why that you two did this book, doing Trump, a critical report on Christian nationalism. Right? It's actually doing theology not just analyzing it critically from a distance. And, here's the opposite book. This one, Trumpocalypse.
What?
President, a battle against the globalist elite and the countdown to Armageddon by McGuire and Anderson. They're cheering Trumpocalypse on. So, to some of it seems valuable that there be an inside critical debunking of this sort of thing as non-biblical, as well as, a broad spectrum analysis and resistance to the fundamentalist, capitalist, nationalist resonance machine.
Did you read the book?
Yeah.
Did you read Trumpocalypse?
Apocalypse?
Oh, that one, yeah.
I was going to ask, is it fiction or not fiction? But I don't think that question makes any sense.
Sorry. Yeah. Right. It thinks it's very straight newsy facts. Right?
I think I got to run.
All right, guys.
All right. Thank
you so much for being with us. It was really appreciated.
Okay. Thank you.
Enjoyed it so much, Preston and Matt.
Yeah, great.
What you're doing.
Good to see you again.
Thank you.